Hey guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined as always by Scott Karasik. We are back after a week layoff during the holidays. We're back for our first show of 2018, now entering our fifth year of doing this show. We're going to be talking about the Week 17 win over the Panthers. We'll mention a little bit about the Week 16 game against the Saints just because we missed it last week, and I'm sure Scott has a rant that he may or may not decide to go on this week. And we'll also be previewing the upcoming matchup against the Los Angeles Rams and this weekend in the wild card playoff game. As usual, we'll be answering your mailbag questions. But as we often do at the top of the show, we like to talk about some recent roster moves that we may have missed in the previous week's episode. Now we have 2 weeks worth of roster moves. Of course, the biggest news came today. The Falcons wound up sitting Andy Levitre for the remainder of the 2017-2018 season, putting him on IR with a torn triceps injury that he suffered a couple of weeks ago on Sunday against Carolina, but sort of re-aggravated and he's done for the season. To replace him on the roster, they elevated Terrence McGee, the running back, from the practice squad. They also last week wound up elevating Jamil Douglas, the guard from the practice squad, to the roster, cut Deji Olatoye to make room for him. And the two practice squad spots were filled up by Lucas Crowley, an offensive lineman, and Rennell Hall, a wide receiver. So I guess, Scott, let's talk about this Levitre move. We got a question from Bruce Long at ATL Bruce Luan. He asked, Levitre's placed on IR, how much will this impact our offensive line?
It'll probably impact it pretty heavily. As we've seen, at least the last couple of weeks, we've seen Ben Garland in there playing. But Levitre not being in there practicing all week and then switching out to Ben Garland should make it a little easier for the offense to keep some momentum and some rhythm. I don't think there's that much of a drop-off in pass protection from Garland to or from Levitre to Garland. I think the issue is the run game. When you have Garland in there and Levitre doesn't have the same kind of timing and rhythm or Garland doesn't have the same kind of timing and rhythm with Matthews and Mack that Levitre does. He doesn't have that same kind of everybody's taking a step to the left on this outside zone. Everybody's taking a step to the right on this outside zone, knowing exactly what they have to hit. But that has gotten better the last few weeks, and it doesn't hurt that Wes Schweitzer, Ryan Schrader are really, really starting to get into a rhythm together the last half of the year. I don't know what's gone on the last half of the year, but it looks like they finally have gotten it together between those two guys. I do need to see a little bit more outside zone because I think that's where the team will be better in the run game. And if they do that, I think you can mitigate some of the loss of Levitre. But with the amount of toss plays they've been calling, it makes it tough.
Okay. Yeah, I think losing Levitre is obviously a tough blow, particularly this week, since they will be going up against arguably the best player in the NFL in Aaron Donald. And obviously, if you have a backup guard, even though I do agree with you, I don't think the drop off from Levitre to Ben Garland has been massive to the point where people need to be overly concerned about Ben Garland's role as a starter. But obviously, you have a backup guard going up against potentially the best player in the NFL, so that's going to be probably problematic. And there's going to be no shortage of good defensive tackles that Ben Garland has the potential to face the rest of this postseason. Including Philadelphia with Fletcher Cox, potentially Minnesota with Linval Joseph, and of course we know New Orleans and Carolina have good guys in the middle in Kawan Short and Cameron Jordan. So I think losing Levitre hurts, but I don't think it's a massive blow to the Falcons' offensive line. I think Garland pulling his time replacing him, keep that streak going up against a guy like Donald this week. But I don't think it really changes too much about the Falcons offense. Levitre's probably a little bit more consistent snap to snap than Garland is, but I do think Garland, when he's good, and there's really no drop off. There's just times every game, there's probably a handful of snaps where you're like, ooh, Garland's a backup offensive lineman. So I think I think the Falcons will be fine, generally speaking, but Aaron Donald's coming to town. So even if Levitre was playing, the thing I'll say is even if Levitre was playing, I'd still be just as worried about Aaron Donald coming to town as I would be if he wasn't playing. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference just because Aaron Donald is just on a different level. Even if Zach Martin was playing in this game for the Falcons at left guard, I'd still be concerned about Aaron Donald. So yeah, not a huge impact. Evan Birchfield's question is: with McGee being added to the roster, are you worried about Devontae Freeman? Are you worried Devontae Freeman may not play?
I'm not really worried about Devontae Freeman going or not. Like, everything says he went back in after he suffered his knee injury, and then he aggravated it again later. But I don't see him not playing. I think they're just gonna. How do I put this? I think they're gonna just keep him out of practice for the most part. He'll be limited probably tomorrow and probably Thursday, but he'll play. This is just my thought. And I think we're going to see the same thing with Julio.
Well, yeah, Julio's consistently been, resting on Wednesday. I'm a little worried. I'm not going to panic yet. We'll see how the rest of the week goes, but it is a minor concern that the Falcons this quickly elevated McGee to the roster, which is usually a move that they would sort of be like, bringing 4 running backs to the roster this week suggests that they don't believe one of their guys is going to be fully healthy for the game. Now that we'll see what Devontae is able to do, but certainly if he's not 100%, I do think there is some cause for a concern about whether or not the Falcons can win this game against the Rams if they don't have both Devontae and Tevin Coleman in the game. Obviously, Devontae's missed time this season. The Falcons were able to survive that, but I certainly disagree with a lot of people's sentiment that the Falcons' offense is a little bit more streamlined or more effective when only one of those guys is getting the bulk of the carries. I don't really agree with it. I think the diversity and the variety that those 2 guys bring is an asset. Maybe it's an asset that Sark hasn't necessarily been able to consistently master each and every week, but I certainly think the team is much better with both of those guys in the lineup and playing their best football than they are with only one of those guys, being at 100% or something like that. So I am a little worried about it. I'm not going to panic about it yet. And, if he misses tomorrow's practice, then I might start to panic a little bit. But we'll see how it goes. Okay, let's talk about the last 2 games. We'll start off with the Week 16 game against the Saints. We won't go too in depth on it like we usually do, but I'm sure Scott may have some choice thoughts. I know he basically promised an epic rant last week, and so we'll see if his pressure has been calmed down in the days since. But one of the key stats from the game was that the Falcons, being the league's best third down offense, was only able to convert 2 of 13 third downs against the Saints, among other issues going on in that game, including potentially the penalties. Scott, do you have any thoughts about the Week 16 loss to the Saints before we move on to the Sunday's game against the Panthers?
Yeah, basically the fact that Atlanta was robbed out of about 50 yards worth of penalty yardage from 2 calls that were obvious, defensive pass interference that were never called fully. They just said, hey, we're going to pick these up. No big deal. Marshawn Lattimore didn't actually pass interfere with him. He only grabbed Julio, threw him to the ground, and completely interfered with him. But whatever. The fix was in. But Atlanta still could have won the fucking game. Use of a better word. They could have won the game. They had to score from 2 situations where they had the ball at what? The 2-yard line? Or was it the 1-yard line?
Yeah, the 1, I think.
And Devontae Freeman fumbled one of them. And that was ugly. They had the ball at the 2-yard line, and Freeman fumbled it. Or no, the 1-yard line, and Freeman fumbled it. And then the other one, they go 75 yards down the field. They get it down to the 1-yard line, or they get down to the 6, and Julio Jones scores a touchdown, and it was ruled wrong on the field, and there wasn't enough video evidence to overturn it. So that was bullshit, because it should have been ruled a touchdown to begin with, but I digress. Devontae Freeman gains 0 yards on 4th and goal from the 1. And I'm sitting here going, why are they calling single back, 3 wide receiver plays right up the middle from the 1-yard line? Like, I get you like 11 personnel, but the 1-yard line is not where you do 11 personnel. That's where you bring in your fatties. That's where you do your 7 offensive linemen, your Poe at fullback, your Austin Hooper for that quick out on a play action. Like, it worked last time. It worked in the last game. They scored 2 touchdowns with that same package last game. Why change? I don't understand. They've shown they can't stop that package. They've shown they don't know how to defend it well. So why change it? I don't understand what they were doing. So that would have been one thing that I would have changed. And I think if they change that alone, Atlanta wins that game 27-23. Those two plays from the 1-yard line. You know, obviously Freeman has to hold on to the damn ball, but assuming Freeman holds on to the ball, they score 2 touchdowns there.
Fair enough. Yeah, you know, I don't have too much commentary on the officiating. Obviously, it was a unbalanced game. I don't think the officials did as bad a job as calls, but they missed some calls every single game, so I don't think it's as big a deal as people made it out to be. You're right. The Falcons had a number of opportunities that they did not take advantage of in that game to win it. And, you know, that's really what it boils down to me. They did not play their best football. We saw uncharacteristic problems. You mentioned 2 of them, particularly at the goal line. I don't really have a problem with them going 11 personnel. I wouldn't necessarily argue that it was the ideal. Teams spread the field out a lot inside the 2-yard line, so it's not that big a deal to me. Issue when you don't score, and then people are like, go heavy and run it in, which again is understandable. When you don't execute, there are always questions. So you got to execute. Yeah. So that's all I really have to say about the Saints game. It's now in the past. We are moving on to bigger and brighter things, including this Week 17 win over the Panthers. The Falcons won 22-10 to finish their season 10-6, clinching a playoff berth. The 6th seed, which we will talk about their upcoming matchup against the Rams later on. But I thought some of the key stats in this game was Matt Ryan did drop back to pass 46 times in this game. That was the most we've seen him drop back to pass season. He wound up completing 28 of 45 passes for 317 yards and a touchdown. Devontae Freeman, Tevin Coleman, both combined for 11 catches, the bulk of that being from Freeman, for 99 yards and a touchdown on 13 targets. I didn't quite look it up, but I'm pretty willing to bet that 13 targets combined to the running backs is probably the most we've seen this season. The Falcons were able to generate 3 turnovers, scored 6 points off of them, 5 on field goals, connecting on 3 kicks from 30-plus yards, 1 from 40, and a 56-yarder, which I think matches his season high this year, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, overall, not necessarily the best offensive performance from the Falcons, but certainly a good enough offensive performance. And I think a lot of that had to do with the injuries they had on the offensive line, not being able to run the football particularly well, even if they were fully healthy against the Panthers, just because healthy against the Panthers the last time they played and only managed 53 yards rushing, which was their lowest of the season. And particularly their throws to the running backs were designed by Sarkisian, use the quick passing game and the short passing game. The running game, like, if you want to run the ball, typically you're going to shoot to try to get 4 to 6 yards. You run the football, but if you pass the ball and get those 4 to 6 yards, it really doesn't make that much of a difference with how you get those yards as long as you get them. So I think that was really a part of the Falcons' strategy, and which led to Matt Ryan throwing the ball so much, led to Matt Ryan throwing so much to the running backs. I think the Falcons knew that their offensive line, interior offensive line, particularly with Alex Mack dealing with that calf strain, did not play particularly well. This Panthers game, Kawan Short gave him a lot of problems, but so did a number of other Panther defenders. And I think that was all part of the Falcons strategy, where they knew they would have to sort of figure out ways to be creative to sort of offset some of those issues that they face. And I think, even though it wasn't the best performance from the Falcons offensively, from a sort of scheming standpoint, you could argue that this was the best game that Steve Sarkisian called in terms of smarting the opposing team, in terms of what he did to play that sort of mental chess game. Scott, do you have any thoughts on this game?
I mean, the run game just couldn't get it going, but I do like what Sark did with the shorter passes, and they were basically using the passes to try and tire out Thomas Davis underneath. Like, yeah, Davis was getting a tackle on every single one of them, but he was running at least 15, 20 yards every single play just to make that tackle. So I don't disagree with you that it was a good idea to have those guys have 11 catches, 99 yards, and a touchdown on basically just short crossers all day. And they were there all day for him, too. The only thing I really didn't like was the fact that they couldn't score touchdowns off these turnovers. I think if they take 2 of those interceptions, score touchdowns off of them instead of field goals, I feel a lot more comfortable heading into the playoffs with a 30-10 game over the Panthers than what it was.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly had opportunities. They weren't quite able to finish some drives. But again, I think a lot of that is a testament to how good the Panthers defense is. They are one of the best, they're arguably one of the top 5 defenses in the league this year. So the fact that the Falcons couldn't necessarily, had to settle for a couple of field goals is not necessarily a crime, given that they have in the league. So, yeah. Let's move on to the Brother of the Week, brought to you by Evan Birchfield. It is the player on the Falcons that had the best game but won't get any of the headlines. For me, I'm going to go with Courtney Upshaw, just because this season, I tweeted yesterday my tally on the run stops and pass stops for the entire season. 4 this entire season, not a gaudy number by any means, but 3.5 of them came against the Panthers, including, I think, 2.5 of them. And he did play probably one of his better games. I think he gets a little bit extra motivated. He went to Alabama. Cam Newton went to Auburn, probably holding some old grudges there, some old Iron Bowls back in the day. So, I'll give Courtney Upshaw some credit. Monster game, but certainly flashed a lot more in Week 17 than he has throughout most of this season. So he's my Brother of the Week.
I'm going to give it to Takk McKinley. He was playing a lot basically in reserve of Adrian Claiborne, and he was getting after the quarterback, and he created a ton of pressure, but they weren't able to seal any of his sacks. But he was in there all day, creating pressure. He was wreaking havoc in the backfield. He was making plays beyond the line of scrimmage. He was making plays behind the line of scrimmage, but just wasn't getting credit for the tackle because someone else would get there first. But he was keeping his gap discipline. Like, if there is a guy that is ready to make the next move, it's Takk McKinley. And I can't wait to see 2018 when McKinley and Vic Beasley and all these guys have super defined roles, and Duke Riley's got another year. I thought Duke Riley was playing well too, but I can't wait to see front 7 sets with basically a 3-4 of McKinley and whoever they take in the first round, or if they re-sign Poe at nose tackle, and then Grady Jarrett on the inside too. Like they've got so much they can do, and I think McKinley is showing why he was taken as high as he was. For a guy who's 250 pounds, he plays like he's 290 pounds sometimes. The way he sets the edge, the way he holds up against the run, the way he just powers through offensive tackles. Love watching him play, and I'm glad I was wrong about him in the draft.
There you go. Now let's move on to the big game this weekend, Saturday night game, where the Falcons will be facing the Los Angeles Rams on. The Rams, interesting enough, are 4-4 at home this year due to the not having a home field advantage. You can argue the Falcons also are suffering from not having a home field advantage, given the new stadium and whatnot. At least the typical home field advantage that they usually experience.
5-3 though.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, like, relative to most years where you expect the Falcons to go 6-2 or 7-1 at home, this year hasn't quite been the same. But it's a minor nitpick, just minor.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Rams are interesting. They've been a much better road team this year. So that does give you the Falcons a potential leg up. Again, they got a 50-50 shot of winning at home. The Rams do. Interesting week because the Falcons have been relatively healthy as of late, but we mentioned at the top of the show Devontae Freeman and Julio Jones. Both of those guys missed practice today. They are questionable with ankle/rib injuries for Julio. He took a big shot for Mike Adams early in the game, came back, but certainly was shaken up. Devontae Freeman dealing with a knee injury. You got Andre Roberts, who was shaken up in the game, dealing with an ankle and knee injury. Levine Toilolo, who's missed last week's game, is coming off an MCL strain. He's questionable. Taylor Gabriel dealing with a hamstring injury, missed most of last game. Alex Mack, knee injury. Adrian Claiborne was able to gut through a calf injury, but there was a moment during the game where they showed him crying on the sideline. Was able to come back and play, but certainly the Falcons aren't necessarily their healthiest. But many of those players might wind up playing anyway. Levitri's the only guy that's been technically ruled out as of yet, so something we'll monitor as the week wears on. The Rams at least are a little bit healthier in certain areas. Farrell Cooper's dealing with a shoulder injury. Mark Barron's dealing with an Achilles injury. He's questionable to return. Roger Saffold dealing with a rib injury. He's probably going to come back. Alec Ogletree sat out last week along with several Rams players to get healthy with an elbow injury. He'll probably play, it sounds like, but we'll see how his status is. Cooper Kupp's dealing with a knee injury. He'll probably also play as well. He was limited in practice last Friday, so we'll see how he fares. But, those are some of the key injuries for the Rams side. So neither team is fully healthy at this point. I would argue that the Rams injured players are a little bit less critical to their success as the Falcons are. But we'll see how the rest of it goes. Scott, what are your thoughts on some of the upcoming matchups heading into this game?
I mean, the Falcons have – I would argue that the Falcons actually have less injuries because the Rams aren't sitting there without their starting kicker. Like, the Rams don't have Greg Zuerlein. The Rams don't have their starting fullback. The Rams don't have Dominique Easley, who would have been a starting defensive lineman. They don't have their starting right corner, Kayvon Webster. So, I mean, yeah, the Rams are not as critical because they don't have, like, premier star players like Julio or Devontae or Mack or Gabriel, those kind of guys injured. But I think the Falcons are going to be in a lot better situation than the Rams are come Sunday. Because I think pretty much everybody's going to play for Atlanta. I think the only guys that won't play are the ones that are on the injured reserve. And for the Rams, the ones that won't play, like, you might not see Mark Barron play because of his Achilles. You might not see Ogletree play because his elbow is pretty messed up. So I think the Falcons will end up being a little bit healthier, but I don't think either team has injuries that you're really too worried about, except for maybe Andy Levitre for the Falcons. And if the Rams can't go with Ogletree or Barron, that'll be huge for them. But the matchups that I look at that kind of freak me out, one is Aaron Donald. Not a fan of trying to deal with him. He is a world record. He's the best defensive line in the NFL today. He's a guy who doesn't get 20 sacks, but might as well every time he steps on the field because he creates so much pressure and he makes ridiculous plays that you're not expecting to. And he helps a guy like Michael Brockers, who's probably an above average guy, look like a Pro Bowl guy because of just how good he is. Now, on the flip side, the Falcons have to show they can stop Todd Gurley. The linebackers have improved. Duke Riley's improved tremendously since his injury. He's finally wrapping up when he tackles, that was the big thing that everybody was mad about. So as long as they can sustain what they've been doing, as long as Riley can continue to wrap up, as long as Jones can continue to wrap up, and these guys can keep making these open field tackles and stopping people like right there and swarming to the ball the way they have been the last few weeks, I think the Falcons will be able to hold off the Rams in this game, or at least put up a good fight in this game.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be an interesting game. I think the Falcons have the capacity to take care of business against the Rams. You know, the good thing, McVay's offense is very similar to what Shanahan's offense is, so it's not as if the Falcons, even though they haven't played the Rams, this offense in a while, they should be pretty familiar with it. You're right, Aaron Donald is going to be the key. If they let Aaron Donald wreck their offense, which he is more than capable of doing, they're going to really struggle to outscore the Rams in this game. Obviously, stopping Todd Gurley is going to be huge. The Falcons' running defense has been much better as of late. The linebacker play has been much better down the stretch, particularly because Deion Jones's uptick in performance in the month of December. I'm a little bit more confident heading into this game in terms of keeping Gurley contained than I probably would have been 6 weeks ago. But those two guys, if we can sort of keep those guys under our thumb, prevent them from going buck wild, you're not going to be able to shut them down, but you can certainly contain them as best you can. And outside of that, I'm not necessarily looking at the Rams offense as something that's or their defense really that's something that's really scary. Robert Quinn isn't necessarily the guy that he was a couple of years ago when he was arguably the best pass rusher in the NFL. Their secondary, Tremaine Johnson, from what I understand, he'll shadow number one receivers when they face him. So he'll probably shadow Julio Jones. They'll give him a lot of safety help. I don't think that's Tremaine Johnson's a perfectly fine NFL cornerback, a solid starter. I don't think he's necessarily going to be a guy that we should expect to really do a number on Julio Jones in any significant way, like to the same degree that we've seen guys like Xavier Rhodes or Josh Norman keep Julio in check. So I don't think the Rams will necessarily be able to do much in that regard. And I do think the Falcons, as they did a year ago against the Broncos, which were coordinated by Wade Phillips, I think they can attack those inside linebackers with Ogletree and Barron being nicked up and not necessarily being the world's greatest guys in coverage. Obviously, Devontae's nicked up as well. The Falcons don't have as favorable an advantage there, but Tevin Coleman certainly was a huge, huge part of that Broncos game a year ago, and I think he could be again this week. But again, the question has always been, will Sark get to use him? We've seen him make some plays in the passing game the last two games, so that's certainly a positive sign that he's going to be a little bit more involved this week. But I think the key boils down to turnovers and the Falcons creating pressure. I think the Falcons can keep the Rams offense in check. Obviously, if they can slow down Gurley and if they can get pressure on Jared Goff. Jared Goff has not been the best quarterback in the league in terms of his accuracy and his ability to play under pressure. He's still a young guy, still learning the game. The Rams rely heavily on the play action passing game. I think they use play action more than any team in the league this year, similar to the Falcons last season. According to Pro Football Focus, Jared Goff has the third worst accuracy rate for starting quarterbacks in the NFL when he's under pressure. We know Vic Beasley has had success against Rob Havenstein, the Rams right tackle. Andrew Whitworth is going to be a much tougher nut to crack. But I think the guards, even if Saffold comes back, are a little bit vulnerable. So I expect Poe in Jarrett to have big games. We'll need them to have big games. If Claiborne and Tack can do whatever they can do on the right side of the line going against Whitworth, that'll be great. But I do think the Falcons need to create turnovers on the back end. That's going to be the best way to stop the Rams. That's going to be the best way to get opportunities for this offense to put as many points on the board as possible, because I don't think this is going to be a low-scoring game like we've grown accustomed to. I do think the Falcons are going to have to show that they can, get up into the upper 20s if they want to beat this Rams offense, who are the number one offense in the NFL. But the other factor playing in the Falcons' favor, historically, quarterbacks do not play well in their first playoff start, and that certainly plays into their favor that maybe Jared Goff will pull an Andy Dalton and completely crack the bed. I think McVay's too good a coach and a coordinator to let that happen to a huge degree, but certainly I'm not going to complain about it if Jared Goff winds up looking like 2016 Jared Goff as opposed to 2017. Okay, so we got a couple of mailbag questions from some listeners about this game. Evan Birchfield's first one is, what is your score prediction for Atlanta versus the Rams?
Ooh. Falcons 24, Rams 20. I think the Falcons are going to be able to hold off the offense of the Rams because they're able to create pressure on that weak side against Happenstein. I think between Tack and Vic, they could create a ton of pressure. He doesn't handle speed well. Atlanta can hit him with speed all day. I think Andrew Whitworth is Andrew Whitworth. Like, you might get that one lucky sack from either Claiborne or Reed on that side, but I don't see creating a ton of pressure on that side. And inside, I mean, Saffold's okay, but Sullivan really knows what the hell he's doing in pass pro. So it's going to be tough to create interior pressure on those guys. They're not a great run blocking line, though. And I think that's where the Falcons will come in and they're not a horrible run blocking line, but they're not like, oh my God, the Rams offensive line is ridiculous. And I think the Falcons have a much better defensive line to take advantage of that than they're getting credit for. Especially with how Poe and Jarrett have been playing as of late, it wouldn't shock me to see Jarrett get 3 more tackles for loss, create these long situations to really hurt the just hurt the Rams offense. Like, I don't see the Rams scoring a ton on this Falcons defense. They've only allowed 19.7 points per game. They're a top 10 defense this year. Whether anyone agrees with me or not, I don't care. I feel comfortable saying, after watching them all season, the Falcons defense this year was a top 10 defense. And it's the only reason why they went 10-6. Because they were able to stop teams when they really needed those stops. And had the offense been able to score an average of like 25 points as opposed to 22 points, this is closer to a 12-win or 13-win team than a 10-win team against arguably the hardest schedule that a playoff team could have faced.
Fair enough. My score prediction, I'm going to go 27-24 Falcons. I think the Falcons have what it takes to slow down the Rams offense. I'm sort of counting on the Rams not getting off to the typical fast start that they have done this season. They are the league's best team in terms of points scored in the first quarter. They are the team that has scored the highest percentage of on opening drives this season. The Falcons are also in the top 3 in that stat as well. So, and they're in the top 4 or tied for 4th in terms of first quarter points. So both of these teams are used to starting out fast. I think because of the lack of playoff experience, the jitters, all that type of stuff, and because the Falcons defense has been coming on as of late, my expectation is that the Rams will not be able to get out to that quick, fast start that they've grown accustomed to this season. And I think if that's the case, the Falcons certainly have what it takes to outlast the Rams. I do think the bulk of the Rams' success, from what I can tell, and again, I'll admit I haven't watched a ton of Rams this year, but I think a lot of it is based around Gurley and Donald. And I do think outside those two, there's not a whole lot that the Rams have that really, really does scare me. Certainly, they're more than capable of beating the Falcons. Otherwise, they wouldn't be the number one scoring offense and finish 11-5 this year. But I do think the Falcons up with them in a much more favorable way than they do some of these other potential other upcoming NFC opponents that they may face should they win this Saturday. So, a relatively high scoring, not sort of the, we've grown accustomed to all these 20-17, 23-20 type of games that the Falcons have played as of late. I think it'll be a little bit more high scoring than that, but certainly I don't think we're going to be like in a 35-34 type of game or anything like that. So we'll see what happens. Next question is from Had to Go There. He asks, all I want to know is if we can man up those receivers. Will that and can Deion tackle Gurley without getting trucked?
I mean, I think Deion can tackle him a couple times without getting trucked, but he's going to get trucked here or there.
Yeah, he's going to get trucked. I mean, no. That's not, the
right.
answer is
no. As long as he minimizes his getting trucks to like once or twice in the game as opposed to like 30 times in the game, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah. It's going to happen. There's going to be a time where Deion Jones and Todd Gurley meet in the hole, and Deion Jones is not going to get the better end of that. And I would argue that, if that happens 5 times in the game, I would certainly expect Todd Gurley to get the better of Deion Jones at least 3 of those 5 times. So the odds are not necessarily in Deion Jones' favor. That's why I think it's important that the defensive line does their thing. I think generally speaking, the Falcons' run defense has been better when the defensive line is playing well, not necessarily because the linebackers are playing great. As for the wide receivers, Sammy Watkins is Sammy Watkins. We know he's capable of being great, but he hasn't had necessarily the monster season that I think people expected of him. But he's played well this season. Don't get me wrong. Deep threat for them.
Their receivers don't scare me.
Yeah, Kupp and Woods have been played well this season, but I've never, I thought Robert Woods was a good player at USC, and I thought, some of the issues in Buffalo weren't necessarily all his fault. But, Kupp, I think more of those two guys are more the product of the system than necessarily like those are two guys that really scare me. But, the one vulnerability that the Falcons have had this season in terms of their secondary has been their slot cornerback play. Brian Poole has been certainly capable this year, but hasn't always been great this year. And Woods and Kupp, a lot of their success comes from playing in the slot. So an issue. I don't expect Brian Poole to shut either one of those guys down, but at the same time, I don't expect either one of those guys to go off against Poole. Like, oh my God, cut Brian Poole. Whatever the overreaction tends to be when someone has a bad game or anything like that, particularly in the postseason. So I'm not too worried about it.
I think we can both agree, though, that like it's probably time for the Falcons to improve on Brian Poole when the offseason comes around.
Yeah, I think Brian Poole has shown he's more than capable. I certainly wouldn't bet against him being the nickel cornerback when we open up the season next year, but I certainly would agree with you that the Falcons at least need to make an attempt to add another young cornerback that can be a little bit more of that, man-heavy guy that would then either play in the slot or on the outside and then allow a guy like Alfred or Trufant to play in the slot.
Exactly.
And then, if Brian Poole's your fourth corner, then you're pretty good at cornerbacks. So,
yeah, I'm not saying cut Brian Poole because he's a good special teamer for the most part. He has stupid stuff he does every now and again, but there's a lot of times when I'm like, get him off the field in special teams because he's holding, but it's always on returns. When he's running down the field as a gunner, love him. When he's trying to block somebody, hate him. But that's neither here nor there. I would just love to have a guy who is basically the same guy as him, but with 4.4 speed as opposed to 4.7 speed.
Yeah. Brian Poole's always going to have a role on this roster. Sort of Jason Snelling type of players who you may not love him every time he's out there on the field, but he's the type of guy that you want to have on your roster because he can do a lot of things well. He just may not do everything amazingly well. So yeah, he'll stick around on this Falcon team for a pretty long time, I imagine. And again, we could wind up adding a cornerback this offseason relatively high in the draft, probably higher than maybe some people might think at this point in time. We'll see how it goes, but it wouldn't shock me at all if that person still loses the battle of Brian Poole, because Brian Poole lay down for anybody. So we'll see how it goes.
I think the best thing to compare Brian Poole to is Kevin Mathis from back in the mid-2000s for the Falcons. He's always going to be there. He may get beat every now and again, but there's going to be like one or two plays he makes throughout the year where you're like, damn, that's why he's in on the field. It's going to be like a turnover. Like, watch, this week after talking so much shit about Brian Poole, he's going to go out there and get a pick, like a clutch-ass pick, and then return it to the 5, and then the Falcons score a touchdown to win this game or something like that. Like, that seems to be my luck with guys like Brian Poole. I talk a little bit of shit. They probably hear it, and then they go, yeah, I'm going to go score a touchdown and fuck this guy's world up. And I'd just be like, hey, I'm wrong.
Yeah. I mean, like, the thing about, we've had Brian Poole on the show. I hope he doesn't listen to this and say, screw those guys. I'm never going to come back on the show, because we would love to talk to him again.
No, I love Brian Poole, the person. I just think that if he was like a 4-4 guy as opposed to a 4-7 guy, he'd be more valuable for the Falcons, and he wouldn't get beat on some of these plays where it's like 3rd and 8, and then he's getting beat on like a 7-yard route and gives up 12. Like, it's nitpicky. Like, I'm being nitpicky as shit right now, but that's what I think. Like, I would love to have a guy who's basically Tyrann Mathieu. That's basically what I'm saying. Like, give me Tyrann Mathieu and let me improve on Brian Poole with that. I would spend a first-round pick on a guy like that. Like Derwin James.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Brian Poole is 9.5. He runs like a 4.6. And so you're always going to look at those physical limitations and always be like, can't we do better than that? And then Brian Poole's going to go out there and he's going to work his tail off, and he's going to bust his hump, and he's going to potentially beat out the guy ahead of him, like a Jalen Collins, like we saw this offseason with Jalen Collins, who everybody knew that was light years more talented than Brian Poole was, and certainly had a much higher upside. Was sort of penciled in as the nickel cornerback. Obviously, there was other issues going on with Jalen Collins, but it's one of those things where the Falcons could wind up using a 1st or 2nd round pick on another cornerback, and that guy could be riding the bench behind Brian Poole over the next 2-3 years or whatever, just because that's the type of dude that Brian Poole is. He's going to work his tail off. And
they're not going to spend a 1st-round pick on a corner. Not in this draft with this many good linemen.
Okay, we'll see. I'm not making any predictions.
I just don't see it. Unless that guy is like Minkah Fitzpatrick, because he somehow falls like way too far, I just don't see it happening.
I wouldn't predict it. I'm not predicting it. I'm just saying, like, I wouldn't rule out the possibility. Don't take a defensive tackle in the 1st round. I'm looking around the rest of the roster and I'm like, what other positions are they going to pick? And if you get a Bradley Roby chilling in the back half of the 1st round, I don't know why you wouldn't take them.
I know you're going to hate me for saying this, but wide receiver makes too much sense.
Okay. Yes, I do hate you for saying that. So,
like, Mohamed Sanu, yeah, he's good. He's a good, solid number 2. Julio Jones is obviously the best receiver in the NFL. But after them, you've got Justin Hardy, who's a good, solid, like, 3B kind of guy, and no one else really on the roster except for Marvin Hall. Why not get a guy who's got that ridiculous speed, that ridiculous physicality, something that he offers to your team that you don't already have? Like, even if it's a guy like Cortland Sutton, who's basically Plaxico Burress, I would still take that guy and just add him to the receiver core, because if you have Sanu in the slot or Cortland Sutton outside and Sanu outside and Julio in the slot. Like, no matter how you do it, you're going to have three guys who are like 6'4", 220 pounds going out there and knocking people's heads. I would take that kind of guy over a cornerback like, I don't know. I mean, not Denzel Ward. Denzel Ward's good as hell, but I don't see Ward falling that far. Someone like Duke Dawson or Josh Jackson. Like, to me, that guy's not worth that pick. I'd much rather have the wide receiver.
I don't think a wide receiver is worth that pick. I don't. This is the same thing that the Falcons did in the day when they were a running team and they traded their number 2 running back in T.J. Duckett for a number 3 wide receiver in Ashley Lilly. It just didn't make any sense. Like, as a football team is not being, we have so many weapons at wide receiver. Your identity as a football team is pounding the football. And so if you're spending picks on that are not going to do anything, that are going to be the 4th wide receiver as a rookie and may or may not then pass Sanu or Hardy in 2019 or 2020 or may not. My personal philosophy is this. If you're going to use a first-round pick on a wide receiver, you better for damn sure be certain that guy's going to be a future number 1.
Well, then here's my thought.
As far as I'm concerned,
why not take an offensive guard like Will Hernandez in the first round?
Hernandez play
He's
30-pound guy playing in the zone blocking scheme.
He's
doesn't necessarily fit.
He's fast. He does fit. He does fit.
I haven't seen him play. I just haven't seen him on paper.
He's like George Foster. He's surprisingly quick for a 330-pound dude. Like, you see him pull and trap, and you're like, holy shit, this guy's quick. I'm enjoying watching him, but.
Okay. All right, well, you could argue George Foster busted and zone blocking scheme, but interesting comparison. I don't know. I don't believe in
instead of tackle.
George Foster was fine. If you're comparing a guy to George Foster, that doesn't make me excited about his NFL potential. That's all I'm saying. I don't know. Wide receiver is just not a position. I'm not a fan of that. Like, I don't see why you're drafting a number 4 wide receiver before the 4th round. That's my opinion. It's the same situation with running back last year.
So do you take Mark Andrews?
I need to watch more of Andrews just because I'm not a huge fan of pure spread tight ends.
What about Taven Bryan?
I would be more, anybody along the defensive line, I'll be mostly fine with.
Yeah, I don't think that's what I keep telling you. Like, cornerback doesn't really make sense because you've got 3 guys that you're like, all right, I like these 3 guys. Safety doesn't make sense because you've got safeties galore. Linebacker doesn't make sense because you just went out and got Duke Riley, Deion Jones, and Devondre Campbell the last 2 years. Offensive guard does make sense because, Andy Levitre, you may or may not have him. Tight end makes sense because Sarkisian likes to run 2 tight end sets more than he likes to run 12 personnel, and I feel like we've seen that this year. Wide receiver does make sense a little bit. Running back, not so much. Quarterback, not at all. So where do you go? You go defensive line or edge player. Like, if Arden Key or Harold Landry is there, why not take them? You're rotating your defensive ends in all the time anyway. You might as well add another gun for the rotation.
I do not want another 250-pound edge rusher.
I'm with you, but I would much rather have Taven Bryan or Bradley Chubb if you could get Bradley Chubb, but that dude's going top 5. Give me Taven Bryan. Give me the true strong side defensive end that can slide down and play 3 technique in the nickel the way that they really want, Adrian Claiborne to do. And I think the minute Adrian Claiborne's not on the roster, we're going to see a lot more Vic Beasley and Tack McKinley rushing from the right side.
If I'm not taking a defensive tackle, edge rusher, and I'm looking at, again, it's still January. There's a long way to go before the draft, so I have not even come close to evaluating going to be mentioned in the Falcons. I'm going to look hard at quarterback. You need 3 cornerbacks capable, but as we just talked about, I think you're right over him. Robert Alford's almost 30 years old. I think this defense is so predicated on being able to play man coverage, and I think that's a huge, massive spot to upgrade. The other positions, while you can certainly argue are much more need positions, have quite the value of, like, if you're going to use a first-round pick on a guard, you want a guy that's going to immediately come in and be an upgrade there. Anybody other than maybe Quentin Nelson, who's probably going to be a top 10 pick, an upgrade over Andy Levitre, or even Wes Schweitzer, just assuming how much growth he shows in year 2.
I don't think Schweitzer's an issue.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. Like, I know other people think that the Falcons should try to upgrade over Schweitzer. I think if you're going to try to upgrade guard, you need to go in free agency. I don't think drafting another young guy. Zone blocking. I think the zone blocking scheme is hard for young players to adjust to and play at a high level. Generally speaking, unless they're force lamp type of players in his draft class, but I don't see any force lamps that are potentially available late in round 1. I know people talk about the kid from Ohio State, Price. He's okay, but he doesn't necessarily get me excited. Like, I'd be like, oh yeah, I definitely want to draft him in the first round. We'll see how it goes. There's your draft talk for the week. I'm sure we'll be swinging back around to some of these opinions later on. Bruce Luan asks 2 questions. What are the Rams' weaknesses in areas of attack? And what are our weaknesses against the Rams that could be a problem?
So the weakest areas for the Rams, I would say, are their run defense. They've got a really good defensive line that somehow can't stop the run. So I would just run outside zone against those guys every single play and, like, base everything off of the outside zone. Basically, I would run last year's offense against these dudes. I would run outside zone. I'd run a lot of play action and roll out off of it. I'd try and feature some deep shots to Julio and Gabriel, and I'd run an outside zone with some screens off of it. And I think you could really do well. I mean, obviously you need to do an outside zone to the right, like the screen to the right as opposed to the screen to the left, but I think you could have a very effective game basically running last year's offense against this defense. I don't think it's a good defense, especially in the front 7, outside of Aaron Donald. And, Michael Brockers is solid, but outside of those 2 guys, like, Quinn isn't what he once was, especially against the run. Ogletree and Barron are light in the seat and don't really do well against the run in general. And Barwin's past his, he's past his prime, long in the tooth, whatever you want to say. So I think that's the biggest weakness for them. And that weakness is huge, especially in playoff football. For the Falcons, their biggest weakness, I would say, is on offense. The fact that they won't have Levitre, the fact that they are still banged up pretty much everywhere. Their offense is what's banged up. They've got 1 guy on defense who's injured. They've got 6 on offense who are injured. So it's one of those, you just try and let the Falcons beat themselves. Like, Atlanta plays undisciplined football. So if the offense just continues to play undisciplined or is continually hurt, you just let them beat themselves. Let them try and figure out what plays are going to work and just call your standard shell. And if you have to, start calling plays off of that once they start kind of figuring out your standard shell.
I think both teams, and to answer this question, Bruce, I'm going to focus on, when you use the word attack, I'm thinking more offensively going against either team's defense. And I think both teams' weaknesses are basically the same position group. I think it's linebacker play. I think the Falcons can attack the Rams linebackers as they did again in that Broncos game a year ago, going up against a Wade Phillips defense. I don't think Ogletree and Barron, while they're probably better athletes than Brandon Marshall or Todd Davis were a year ago, I don't think either one of those guys, Ogletree has been a guy that I've always been underwhelmed with as an NFL player. Like he's basically to me the bad version of Deion Jones. And I don't think he's that good, and I think the Falcons can exploit that. And I also think the Rams look at the Falcons linebackers and think, as we said, Todd Gurley meets Deion Jones in the hole. That's Todd Gurley's going to win. And the fact of the matter is that the chances of Devondre Campbell meeting Gurley in the hole are about zero because Devondre Campbell never manages to find the right hole. So I do think it's one of those things where both teams will try to exploit the other team's linebacker core. I think when you look at the two defenses, while I don't think the Rams secondary is amazing, I think they've certainly played at a high enough level where you can expect competence. And I think when you look at both teams' defenses, if there's one position group that you're going to look at and say, yeah, up and down, I think you look at the linebacker core for both teams and you try to exploit those weaknesses. So we'll see which team does a better job exploiting them. Not confident that the Falcons linebackers will, take care of business. They have a tendency to be a little bit undisciplined. They do have a tendency to miss tackles. They do have a tendency to bite on play action passes. And again, the Rams have run more play action than any other offense this year. So if the Rams can play their type of offense against the Falcons, it could be a problem. But at the same time, I think if the Falcons can play their type of offense against the Rams defense, it could equally be a problem for the Rams. So, all right, Scott, before we answer the rest of the mailbag questions, do you have any call-outs this week that you want to get to?
No, I can't think of any. Outside of, I'll say one thing. Don't ever plan a wedding, y'all. Just elope. Just don't do it. Like, get married. Like, find the right person. Find your person, guy, girl, whatever you're into. I don't care. Get married. Find that person. Don't have a wedding. Don't waste the money. Just take whatever money you were going to do and put it into a house and a badass vacation and just do that instead. Because, boy.
There you go. As some of you guys may or may not know, Scott is getting married this weekend. So he will be able to watch the Falcons play as a married man. Am I not mistaken?
I'm getting married at 4. The reception lasts until about 8:30. So I'm cutting it close, but I'll be able to watch probably the second half of the game.
Okay.
So
I'm sure your fiance will think of things to do with you during the first half.
Yeah, I'm sure.
There you go. To the rest of the mailbag questions. West Country Falcon asks, Aaron, you had reported that earlier in the season the Falcons have one of the poorest starting field position ratings in the league. Are they seemingly constant penalties on special teams the reason for this? We don't seem to be good enough to be, in the great words of Keith Armstrong, assholes.
So here's my thoughts on this. Special teams penalties have hurt a ton. Andre Roberts has not been what I thought he would be, and I like the guy. But the real issue is the Falcons aren't causing enough turnovers. Defensive turnovers last year gave them great field position, and they were scoring touchdowns. This year, there's no touchdowns. They don't get the great field position. They're not getting that interception at the 30-yard line. In the last game, they did that twice. They had 2 defensive interceptions. They brought the ball, to the 40, I think, for one of them, and then the 30 for the other. And they scored 6 points off of them. They should have scored touchdowns, but let's not talk about that. The fact of the matter is they need to create more turnovers, because a turnover takes away momentum, 7 points, and just gives your offense a way better spot. You get a turnover at the 35, your offense scores a touchdown, you go out there, you hold them to a 3-and-out, You don't just have momentum. You have momentum. You created a turnover. You got in their heads, and your offense has the ball again for a nice long drive to help milk the clock. Turnovers are huge. We need more of them.
Yeah, I'm with Scott on this. I think the starting field position stat, which the Falcons finished the season 31st in, I think people are misled by what that stat is really all about. The reality is almost half of all starting drives start out between the 20 and 30-yard line. So what ends up happening is the assumption that people make is when you're 31st or 32nd in starting field position, that it means you have to go longer than other teams. But in reality, what it is other teams, their starting field position gets skewed upwards in the upper 20s to the Falcons' average starting field position, I think, wound up being like the 25 or 26-yard line. Most teams are somewhere around the 28 or 29. But other teams that number gets skewed up where with the average is because of what Scott said. You get a lot of short fields off of turnovers. If your defense is good enough to back up teams in their own, when they start out their own drive and then they have to punt deep in their own territory, that gives you good positive field position. And the reality is, because of the lack of turnovers the Falcons have had, and because their defense typically doesn't force teams, quick 3 and outs when they're backed up deep in their own territory, favorable field position spots. So their number doesn't really go up. Their starting field position doesn't go up from the norm, which is, again, around 25, 26 yards, like most other teams. And so there's a false perception that the Falcons are forced to go longer drives than other teams. But it's only longer in the sense that they have to go, on average, 3 more yards than other teams. It's not that big a deal. As far as special teams penalties go, I looked up the numbers. The Falcons are certainly above average in terms of special teams penalties this year, but it's not like a completely out of whack number. So many. So I don't think that's necessarily making as huge an impact as it probably seems like. It does affect some drives. It certainly affected some drives this past weekend where they wiped out a couple of good Andre Roberts returns. Thanks, Leroy Reynolds. You always find some way by the end of the season to disappoint me because of special teams play, and you have done it now 2 years in a row. So it certainly can affect things, but I don't know if I would blame all the fact that the Falcons have a low position on special teams penalties or returns or whatever. It's mostly because they don't have as many turnovers as other teams do.
They are 28th in takeaways this year. Last year, they were 16th. That's all you need to know.
Yeah. Next question comes from Evan Birchfield. Walk us through how you think the rest of the NFC playoffs will turn out over the next few weeks.
So I'm going to be wrong. I'm going to tell you that right now because I'm always wrong with my predictions. But I do think Atlanta wins this week. I do think New Orleans wins on the other game. I think Minnesota beats New Orleans. And I think Atlanta beats Philadelphia. And then I think Minnesota grinds the Falcons into the ground up in Minneapolis and goes to the Super Bowl in their own house. So that's my prediction. Yeah, I think Atlanta gets absolutely slaughtered by Minnesota if they have to go up there. 30-7 slaughtered.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, my predictions aren't that too dissimilar. I got the Falcons winning this week. New Orleans beating Carolina 3 times in the same season seems crazy, but I don't know if Carolina matches up particularly well against New Orleans, so it's certainly possible. So
I think Cam Newton does what he did this past week and throws another 3 picks.
Yeah, we'll see. It's weird. I think Carolina is too good to get beat by the same team 3 times. At the same time, I don't know if Carolina matches up well with this current iteration of the Saints. So I'm going to go with the Saints. I think they're the safer bet here. Again, I think the Falcons versus the Eagles, I think that's going to be a tough matchup, even though Nick Foles is playing like trash. But I think that Eagles defensive line is going to give the Falcons a lot of problems. It's going to be a slugfest. But I do think the Falcons will find a way to win it. The incomparable Julio Jones. I'll go with the Vikings over the Saints. And so, yeah, I got the same NFC Championship game. The Vikings at this point, rematch of the 98 game. Man, it's weird that it's tough to pick Case Keenum.
It's weird that almost 20 years later, that would be a true rematch of the 98 game. I did not even think about that. That would totally be a rematch of the 98 game.
It's like at the beginning of the season, I picked the Falcons to lose the NFC Championship game to the Seahawks. That was my prediction going into the year. Man, now we're sitting here like Minnesota is a really tough matchup for the Falcons, but I feel it feels wrong of me to pick against the Falcons in the NFC Championship game against Case Keenum. But
it feels wrong, but he completed 90% of his passes against the Falcons last time. Like, it feels wrong, but it's not.
Yeah, I mean, Minnesota's defense is just too good. Like, why am I, I feel wrong picking the same picks as Scott did, but yeah, I'm gonna go with Minnesota. I guess winning the NFC Championship game at this point. I think, I'm going with the safe bets. Well, obviously teams will completely blow that up, looking stupid next week, but we'll see what happens. Bruce Luan asks, aside from making the playoffs, 10-6 record, are you satisfied? Better than expected or not?
I'm not satisfied because they had 2 games in the middle of the season that they should have won. I'm okay with losing to New Orleans and New Orleans. I'm okay with losing to Carolina and Carolina. Those don't bug me. I'm okay with the Falcons losing to the Patriots in New England. Those 3 games don't bug me one bit. The games that bug the fool out of me that they lost are the Miami Dolphins game that they lost to Jay friggin' Cutler after being up 17-0. That was ridiculous. And then the Buffalo Bills game where Matt Ryan had a incomplete pass that, both those games are just ridiculously stupid losses. They should have won both those games. Outside of those, every other loss I don't mind. Losing to the Saints in New Orleans, losing to the Panthers in Carolina, losing to Minnesota at home, all those, no big deal. Losing to New England and Gillette, where like no one's won for a decade now against the Tom Brady-led team. So I'm okay with that.
I'm pretty satisfied with this season. The main thing was I just wanted the Falcons to make the playoffs. Obviously I wanted them to play as well as possible, but as long as they make the playoffs, and so the fact that they didn't choke on Sunday, like we've known them to do from time to time, like that was all I needed from this season, really. So even if the Rams blow them out by 30 points on Saturday, I won't be happy about it, but I'll be like, you know what? They made the playoffs. Not every team that loses the Super Bowl makes the playoffs the following year. And while, again, losing to the Rams in embarrassing fashion would not necessarily the season, I'm not going to look back at this season and be like, oh, man, it was such an utter disappointment. Because, I never really expected the Falcons, to go back to the Super Bowl. I, knew that they were certainly capable of doing it, but even though now I just predicted them 5 minutes ago to go to the NFC Championship game, I don't really expect them, even though I know that they're capable of doing it, because I just have those expectations with the Falcons until we're in the NFC Championship game 3 times that's happened in my lifetime. So it is what it is. So I'm satisfied for the most part.
I mean, at this point, I'm perfectly okay if the Falcons – I know that sounds horrible. I'm okay if the Falcons lose this Saturday. I don't want them to lose. Obviously, it would still suck, but I would understand it if they lost. On the flip side, I could also easily see them flipping a switch on offense and somehow winning the Super Bowl this year. Like, there's no in between for this team. They're either going to fall flat on their face in a game, or they're going to absolutely dominate a game.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing, like last year, the Falcons clearly had something great going offensively, and the NFC, other than basically Aaron Rodgers doing Aaron Rodgers type things in Dallas's, running game, there wasn't a whole lot of scary teams in the NFC. And I think the same thing is now, even though the NFC is clearly much better than the AFC. The top three seeds are all don't have the greatest quarterback situations. They're just basically teams that can run the ball and play good defense, which is not a bad thing. That's a recipe for success for obvious reasons. And the two NFC South teams that are also in the playoffs are teams that the Falcons have shown that they can beat. It's like the Falcons are more than capable of making a deep run this year. Again, even though arguably the most flawed team, because they probably have the worst defense of the NFC teams in the playoffs this year, or at least the most inconsistent defense. And their offense certainly has not lived up to their capabilities. But because we know this offense has potential and has a much higher ceiling than they've shown, as Scott said, I wouldn't bet on it happening, but certainly they're more than capable of all the pieces falling into place, and all of a sudden making these good defenses look a lot more mundane. And all of a sudden, if last year's offense was playing some of these defenses, I wouldn't have any concern about, their ability to take some of these defenses apart. But because we don't have last year's offense, that question is a little bit more open.
If last year's offense had this year's defense, they win the Super Bowl.
No doubt about it. We would have won games like 40-17 or something if you combine those two aspects. So yeah, I mean it's there for the taking for the Falcons. So I don't want to sound like I'm like make a deep run. If you guys are confident that the Falcons are gonna make a run, then keep believing. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that you're wrong or anything. It's just at this point in time, I don't, as a longtime Falcon fan, I've learned over the years to not put too high expectations on the Falcons because they have pretty much every year found a way to disappoint me in the end. So it's just one of those things like if it happens, great. I'll be just as happy as everybody else, but I'm not necessarily, I don't need it to happen in order for me to be happy with this season. Okay, last question comes from ATL Sports 404. After we drafted Duke Riley, most assumed he'd eventually become the starting Will linebacker, and Campbell would move to Sam linebacker. Have both seen time there as well. What exactly is the Falcons' plan?
Exactly what you just suggested. It's just going to take a minute for it to come to fruition. Like, it's not going to be instant. As much as we want it to be, it's just not going to be. So as long as we're patient, I think we'll see that happen.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting because I think when you look at the season as a whole, you can make a strong case that Campbell, during that middle portion of the season, when Vic Beasley was playing Sam linebacker, that was the part of the year where Campbell was playing some of his best football. Not when he was playing Sam linebacker at the beginning of the season for the first 6 or so games of the year. But again, it's not to say that Campbell will play poorly. So I think the reality is that the Falcons know Deion Jones is going to be the middle linebacker. The plan is either, depending on if they choose to let Vic Beasley continue to linebacker, which I think they should do, but who knows what Dan Quinn is ever thinking. If they want Vic Beasley to continue to grow as a linebacker, I think a scenario where they just basically rotate based off matchups. In games where we face a really good tight end, then those are probably games where you probably want a bit more involved at the Sam linebacker spot, just because he's going to draw more one-on-one coverage assignments. In other games where the Falcons aren't worried about middle of the field, then you can throw Vic Beasley out there and be like, okay, let's put Vic Beasley off the edge in the base defense, and because we're not worried about teams burning us on the back end because of our coverage and whatnot. And then Duke Riley fits into that puzzle somehow. You know, when the games where Campbell's playing Sam, Duke Riley's playing Will. In the games where Veazey's playing Sam, then Campbell's playing Will. And so you don't have to force anything from anybody. It's just one of those things where it's like you have three potentially capable outside linebackers. Matchups you can rotate them around, and I think that to me is how I would do it. But maybe Dan Quinn wants a little bit more consistency. I think we need to see, my personal opinion, I think we need to see Campbell do a little bit better job in order to deserve his sort of cemented role as one of those two linebackers. I think you can make an argument that with a little bit more development, Beasley would be better options than Campbell at either one of those outside linebacker spots. But again, we'll see. I don't know. I don't know what the plan is, but I think it'll in the end, the Falcons have too much talent that it won't. It'll eventually work out some way or the other.
I agree.
All right, guys, that's it for this week's episode. We appreciate you guys for tuning in this week. We will be back next week to talk about this playoff game. Hopefully, the Falcons will be keeping things going into that Philadelphia Eagles matchup the following week. If not, then I hope you guys enjoyed this 2017 season and our coverage this year. Hopefully, it keeps going. You guys know how to hit us up. The Twitter handles, they should be on the screen. I'm at FalcFan. Scott is at Karasik S. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Falcon Central Radio. Give us a like while you're there so you can stay up to date on all the latest going on with this podcast. Of course, subscribe to Scott's page on YouTube, Central on YouTube. Check us out on ProFootballCentral.com. If you want to get your questions answered on the next episode, by all means, use the hashtag Falcons mailbag. Tweet at us or at the show and whatnot. And so that's it, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed your 2017. I hope 2018 will be even better.